Hello, everyone, and welcome to this channel dedicated to diaries, correspondences, memoirs, autobiographies. Today, we would like to talk about Sigfried Sassoon's diaries and perhaps the best diaries there can be. Now, of course, you all know Sigfried Sassoon. Sigfried Sassoon was a war poet, an English war poet. He was born in 1886 and he died in 1967. So half a century after the end of the war, the First World War, of course. Now, Sassoon is best known for his war poetry and for his protest letter that he wrote in 1917 to protest against the continuation of the war and the treatment of the soldiers. A letter you might remember, which he wrote with Bertrand Russell, or at least Bertrand Russell says that he wrote most of it. And Sassoon is also very famous, I guess, for in prose this time, for his trilogy, his autobiographical trilogy, Memoir of a Fox Hunting Man, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, and the last volume, Sherston's Progress. On top of that, we have different autobiographical writings by Sassoon, Siegfried's Journey, for example, and the War Diaries, which are much less common to find, I think. Now, what is interesting about Sassoon's diaries, published in 3 volumes, is, of course, what they reveal perhaps about Sassoon that is not revealed in the other autobiographical writings. And that is always what is very interesting with narratives of the self, as it's called, autobiographies, memoirs, diaries, where somebody tells something about themselves. There's always the question, of course, of what do they leave out? Do they tell the truth? And did they redact whichever text they give us? Well, that's very much a case in point with Sassoon, Sigfried Sassoon, because the very famous trilogy of Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, for example, a wonderful, wonderful trilogy, exquisitely written. Sassoon had in prose, Sassoon wrote extremely well, in a very sort of semi-detached, ironic, almost typical English voice of that period, perhaps. And so those books really read very well. And the persona that he presents, that is the Sigfried Sassoon that he presents in that trilogy, is a very sort of likable character. Somebody who doesn't boast about anything, on the contrary, very self-deprecating, always seeing himself or talking about himself with a sort of distance and irony, I guess. Now, the point here, of course, is that Sassoon actually did not exactly represent himself according to what had happened. And for example, the trilogy opens with him living with his aunt in a sort of big house in the countryside, because he says, my parents were dead. But actually, his parents were not dead at the time. He wasn't living with that aunt. He simply had a normal sort of childhood. And so we realize immediately that some things are going to have to be read in a certain way. And here the question, of course, is what is true in the Memoirs of the Fox Hunting Man. Well, a lot of it is true. Probably most of it is true. He used his own war diaries extensively to write those volumes. But at the same time, it is clear that he doesn't want to talk about everything. And so he presents Sigfried Sassoon that he wants people to see for whatever reason. Now, that is why those diaries are absolutely wonderful. First of all, again, they're very well written. Again, it's not a flowery style. It doesn't mean very elaborate sentences necessarily. No. He simply had a very again, ironic, light, and at the same time very observant style, and he could manipulate the language really well as well. So it makes for a very good reading experience. Those diaries start when in 1917, so is still, first of all, very young, of course, but he's not yet out of the woods in terms of the war. And as you probably remember, Sassoon will be wounded twice. And the second time, the first time he'll go in convalescence and he will go back to the war. And the second time he's injured, wounded, that will be the end of his career in the war. Now, what is interesting in those diaries is that what you see is that this period, especially the first two, which are between 1917 and 1923, you see a Sassoon who is not the Sassoon of Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man or even the Sassoon of the war poetry. You see a Sassoon wondering, what am I going to do? Who am I going to be? Now, you should remember, I'm sure you remember, that Sassoon had attained great celebrity, not only because of his poetry. Wilfred Owen, for example, was perhaps even more famous for that war poetry, but also for that protest letter, which had been widely advertised. Soldiers typically should not speak out against the army nor against the Ministry of War. So Sassoon in those diaries is wondering, okay, what is going to happen to me in terms of who am I going to be when the war finishes? And when the war does finish, in the beginning of those diaries, this is a pressing question for him. It's a question in terms of identity, that is, what kind of person he wants to be, but also in artistic terms, which is, of course, part of his identity. That is, what kind of poet does he want to be? In fact, what kind of writer does he want to be? And what is fascinating is that you can see throughout the month after the war that Sassoon begins to realize, or realizes, or has realized already perhaps, that of course he cannot go on writing war poetry. And yet that's the thing that made him famous. That's the thing that he knows he can do, and he can do well. He also knows that it is the type of poetry that perhaps people still expect from him. So he encounters what I am certain generations of artists encounter as a problem, which is, well, do I give what people want because they know it, or do I go in search of what my real artistic identity actually is? Do I produce what I've already produced, or do I try to move on and perhaps find something that I like even more, or which I'm even better than that? And so you see here his attempts at writing poems of a very, very different kind, much more elaborate, extremely literary poems, where he's also trying to show off, in certain ways, as he says himself, to show off his technical abilities, because poetry is not simply choosing the right words, it is also how to put them together. And keeping in mind the prosody, the music, and the rhythm and intonation and all those things. And so he tries to write that type of poetry, and sometimes he thinks that it's coming off quite well, but yeah, it's never really convincing. Now, at the same time as he is wondering who he can become, how and what he can become, aspects of his life, which really do not permeate the trilogy of the Fox Hunting Man, is his homosexuality. Now, it's very interesting, this, because in accordance, I guess, with the ways of the time, homosexual men very often would pretend that they were simply good friends, and a strong friendship was accepted and revered, perhaps, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. That's exactly, of course, what Sassoon himself does. He has a partner, a German partner, with whom he travels, for example, through Germany and Italy, and always under pretense, of course, of simply being a couple of friends, good friends, and that was completely fine. Except, of course, that they were more than friends, they were lovers, obviously. And so it's very interesting here to have a much more sort of real Sassoon opening up about his feelings for his lover, for example, but also asking himself what part homosexuality, which he doesn't really call that way, what part homosexuality plays in his being, in his identity, and even dreaming a couple of times in a diary of writing the first great homosexual novel. Now, all those things are completely absent from the rest of his work, I think, and that is one of the things that makes those diaries absolutely fascinating. It's also, of course, that at the same time as all this is happening, Sassoon is facing what millions of soldiers face after the end of any war they're in, and that is, of course, trying to move away from what he saw. And it is well known that soldiers typically find it difficult, and certainly after the First World War, found it almost impossible to talk about what they had seen, and very often didn't want to talk about what they had seen. And that is also one of the problems that Sassoon is obviously trying to deal with, which is keeping away the slaughter, the massacre, the bodies, death that he's been exposed to for 4 years, or 3 years, 3.5 years, to such an extent, because Sassoon was at the front. He wasn't at the back, he was really at the front. So he saw it all. Just like, of course, millions of other soldiers saw it all at the time. And so he's also grappling with that issue of how does one not only reinvent or invent oneself, but also how does one live really after such a massacre. The famous line of that one cannot write poetry after the First World War is certainly one that resonates with him on some level as well. That is, of course, linked with his feelings about the war in general. And so he does talk about that. He does make many remarks about that, because as he grows away from the war, the longer the war has been finished, the more he can also reflect later on, not only on the war as such, but much more reflect on what he did. He got decorations for bravery, for example. He's also very open about this. He describes what happened in his mind as much as in his body. And therefore, all those things are part of his everyday sort of thinking, or just remarking on things. And it's remarkable that those very sort of personal core questions are interspersed with just literary, for example, anecdotes. He talks a lot about Thomas Hardy. He was a great admirer of Thomas Hardy, and he met the great man, and they became quite friends. But of course, Sassoon was also closely linked to the whole literary intelligentsia of London at the time. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him. It was a small world, of course. And so that means that now and again you come across, of course, very famous names of the period, from, I don't know, the Bloomsbury set to T.S. Eliot, to Wyndham Lewis, to any of those people also come by. And that is, of course, also one of the delights of those diaries, because they transport you back to a period, 1920, which was simply an explosion of artistic creation, not only in London, of course, in Paris as well. And Sassoon was, although he didn't exactly mix in a way that, say, the Bloomsbury people did, he certainly was part of it. And so he meets people now and again. And this is also, again, part of the great joys that we get from those diaries. Ultimately, what is fascinating when you get a diary like this is the extent to which the person writing them reflects on themselves and on what they see. There is a great, I think, literary diary, which is the Arnold Bennett diary. So Arnold Bennett, in fact, knew Sassoon. They knew each other. Arnold Bennett was an enormously successful English writer in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, really. And he wrote a great diary where he is very factual, for example, about his methods of writing. So how does he write? How does he compose books? How does he go about his business? He's also very open about all his business ventures and the like. But he's much less, or he allows his diary to be much less self-reflective than Sassoon's. Sassoon's diaries come out as heart on the table, veiled with a very accessible yet ironic and self-detached language, which gives an impression of, okay, look, I'm not taking this too seriously. But you can see that these are very serious questions. Who am I going to be? What kind of writing will I do? Will I ever be able to get to the same heights as I did with my war poetry? What will be my life in all these literary circles? Do I want to belong to it? Do I feel comfortable in it? What kind of person am I in the long term? You may know that Sassoon later on will come into quite a lot of money. And in fact, what will happen is that he will retreat to the countryside. Now, he will be in contact with a whole lot of people. He'll keep publishing poetry, but it will never be anything like as successful as the war poetry. He will, of course, in that sort of retreat away from the literary London, he will write those 3 volumes of the Fox Hunting Man. But really, he will detach himself from what could have been, stay in a close circle of literary figures, make his sort of way in, which would have been very easily possible for him. And he chooses to actually sort of, no, basically, who am I? I am perhaps a gentleman farmer, much more than a literary critic or a jet set type of person. And this is all sort of coming together in those diaries. It is not resolved at the end of the 3rd volume of those diaries, quite simply because he stops writing them and his new life will start afterwards. And so you see the birth of who Sassoon will be for most of his life. I remind you again that he will live until 1967, so very long. And so in that sense, we see the emergence of who the Sassoon will be for most of his life, which is really emerging from the cocoon of the war, the First World War, and what made him so famous. And it is this dichotomy in some ways, and this birth, which makes those diaries a great delight, on top, of course, of everything I said. So in conclusion, are these the best diaries ever written? It is impossible to say, of course, and I do hope to talk about many more of them that are equally great. But those are fascinating, not only because of all those aspects I just detailed, but also because they were written by somebody who is both very famous, but actually famous for only one thing, while his life was much longer and he did many, many more things than that. And so our figure of the protest soldier in 1917, writing those wonderful poems against the war, against the butchery of the war, we come at the end of this persona and we see the development of a new one. And if only for that, those diaries are absolutely priceless. Thank you.